Alarming, unfair and short-sighted. Some of the words being used to describe the federal government's flight ticket subsidy to chosen regions of Australia. The plan was designed to give the tourism sector a boost coming out of the pandemic, but there are some very disappointed areas which feel left out. Political reporter Stephanie Dalzell has more from Parliament House.
Some aspects of the tourism sector say this doesn't go far enough to help the ailing sector. The Australian Tourism Industry Council says it won't stem the loss of jobs and it also won't stop business closures that we've seen in parts of the industry. It also says it won't fill the gap left when the JobKeeper wage subsidy scheme wraps up at the end of this month. Now, the government's consistently said that JobKeeper won't run forever. It's an incredibly expensive program, but it has been under pressure to do something to support the 600,000 jobs that are tied to the tourism industry. So yesterday it unveiled a $1.2 billion tourism support package, which included 800,000 half-priced airfares to several destinations around Australia. Initially, there were 13 destinations and that was then revised to 15. And of those, 4 of them are in Queensland, for example, while just 1 is in New South Wales on the south coast in Merimbula. That has angered a lot of members of the New South Wales government and a lot of local mayors in New South Wales. We heard from the Dubbo Mayor Ben Shields, who's extremely angry about the allocation of these sites. Take a listen to what he had to say.
The idea that we will just continue to leave the Dubbo Regional Airport sitting out there losing money without many flights here while we're throwing money at these Queensland destinations is so unfair to Western New South Wales. In fact, it's quite alarming how short-sighted that this proposal is.
Now, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has defended the scheme and says that many more destinations could be added in the coming weeks. Take a listen to what he had to say.
That's how we've selected the places. It's not selected on the basis of which premiers and states have been naughty and nice. That's not what this is about. This is about trying to get targeted support to those Australians on the ground who need more tourists in those communities. That's what it's designed to do. All of our responses to the pandemic have been targeted, they've been proportionate, they've been temporary.
And Steph, the government appears set to miss its stated vaccine rollout targets. What's the hold-up?
So yesterday we heard from the Health Department boss, Brendan Murphy, who said some Australians may have to wait until next year to get their second COVID-19 vaccine dose. Now, the government's consistently said that Australians will be fully vaccinated by the end of October, but the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is insisting the language hasn't changed here. He says the government has been consistent and that it's always said that Australians will get their first dose of the vaccine by October, saying that single-dose vaccines are still very effective. Now, yesterday, Brendan Murphy also said it was impossible to say whether the government would hit its target of the initial vaccine rollout of 4 million doses by April as slated. We have seen supply issues with these COVID-19 vaccines overseas, particularly the AstraZeneca vaccine. We saw recently that Italy blocked a shipment of 250,000 doses to Australia. And yesterday we found out that of the 3.8 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine that we're expecting from overseas, we've only received 700,000. Now, it is important to note, though, that from March the 22nd, pending approval from the National Medical Regulator, we'll start to make our own vaccines here. And so from there, the rollout will be 1 million doses per week, which is what's expected, and that will significantly boost the speed of the vaccine rollout.
Steph, thank you. A Liberal Party donor who developed relationships with Federal Assistant Treasurer Michael Sukkar and MP Gladys Liu engaged in acts of foreign interference and activities for Beijing. That's according to Australia's domestic spy agency. Sean Rubenstein-Dunlop from ABC Investigations has more.
Well, these are bombshell revelations and they're damaging for the Liberal Party, the federal government, and for the man at the centre of them, a Melbourne-based Chinese businessman called Huifeng or Ha Liu. He donated at least $20,000 to the Liberal Party and developed ties over several years to MP Gladys Liu and the Assistant Treasurer Michael Sukkar. Now, he's now fighting in court to avoid a deportation order issued by the federal government government on the grounds of an ASIO finding last year that he was a risk to national security. And his application to the court, which we've obtained, reveals that ASIO found he was an alleged agent of foreign interference and accused him of lying about his relationships with and work for Chinese government officials. Now, it doesn't specify what acts of foreign interference he allegedly carried out or whether they related to Australian politicians. But we know that for several years he was wined and dined as a donor by Michael Sukar and supported by Gladys Liu, the Federal Liberal Party MP, who was previously a prodigious donor and campaigner for the Liberal Party. Now, Liu was the president of a neighbourhood watch organisation which became very popular in the Chinese community in Australia, more than 55,000 members online, and it had a deal to report information and take instructions from the Chinese consulate in Melbourne. It was also working with the Sydney consulate, and that was on cases involving Chinese citizens deemed to require consular assistance. And there are questions now about whether the information provided by that association was for harm or for good for the Chinese community. Gladys Liu, the Federal Liberal MP, publicly promoted the organisation over several years, as recently as late 2019 as an MP, and even endorsed it to police, helping Liu develop relationships with police and councils. So these are all issues that one could expect ASIO has been raking over, and their findings will be tested in a trial in the federal court.
So what does happen next then, Sean?
So there's a one-day trial which is expected to be heard later this year in the federal court, where we're hoping that further details of ASIO's allegations will be relieved. These are often very opaque decisions made by the Immigration Minister on the back of ASIO findings that usually aren't released. And so this is a rare window into Australia's often hidden campaign against Beijing. Many questions, of course, also to answer for Michael Sukar and Gladys Liu, and we'll see whether that happens.
Sean, thanks. Security figures have expressed alarm at a Chinese-linked company's takeover of an iron ore mine off Western Australia. Last year, the private Hong Kong-based entity secured a 12-year lease for the abandoned iron ore operation on the remote Cockatoo Island. The mine is located next to a military training area. The deal was struck with the approval of the state and Commonwealth governments, and now questions are being raised about whether there was proper scrutiny. The government is downplaying concerns.
Our defence security is number one. I mean, first order of government is to ensure that the protection and defence of our nation is first and foremost, and that's what we do. That's what we do every day in every way. Every government policy is aimed at increasing Australia's defence and security and our nation. We want Australia to go ahead. That's what we do as a government. That's why we are entrusted by the people of Australia to look after them, to look after their interests, and that's what we do.
A Sydney woman who decapitated her mother has been sentenced to 21 years in prison. A judge today called Jessica Camilleri's crime in July 2019 one of extraordinary viciousness and brutality. Jamie McKinnell reports.
Relatives of Jessica Camilleri began to cry in the public gallery today, and one said the words "thank you" to the judge when this huge sentence was handed down in the New South Wales Supreme Court. The 27-year-old was found guilty last year by a jury not of murder but of manslaughter because she was impaired by a mix of mental disorders. She repeatedly stabbed her 57-year-old mother, Rita Camilleri, in the kitchen of their Western Sydney home in July of 2019. Now, during the trial, the court heard she was inspired by her obsession with horror movies, and she was in a fit of rage and fearful of being returned to a mental institution at the time. Today in sentencing, Justice Helen Wilson said the crime was one of extraordinary viciousness and brutality. She said it was extremely violent and sustained, and she noted that Camilleri used 7 different knives during this attack to the point of decapitation, and 4 of those broke.
She must have been in extreme pain and both shocked and terrified at what was being done to her by her own beloved child. Mrs. Camilleri's life was cut short in the most horrible manner imaginable. The lives of others have been forever changed, as the court heard when victim impact statements were given by those whose suffering has been greatest.
The judge also said this case is one of the most extreme examples of manslaughter that a court could be asked to consider. Justice Wilson handed down a sentence of 21 years and 7 months with a non-parole period of 16 years and 2 months. All of the relatives were clearly very relieved and emotional in the public gallery, but they left the court without speaking to the media. Last month, Jessica Camilleri's sister, Christy Teresi, told the court that she will never forgive her sister for this act. She hoped the sentence was long and she didn't care what happened to her after she was released. Camilleri won't be eligible for parole until the year 2035.
Police have seized around 200 kilograms of cocaine, which was being smuggled into Australia by boat. Reporter Ruby Cornish has more from Sydney.
Police say this is a very significant drug seizure. 200 kilograms of cocaine seized from a vessel off the coast of New South Wales in the early hours of yesterday morning. It's what police call a mothership-daughtership operation. So the mothership was a large container ship that began its journey in Antwerp, Belgium, and travelled into Australian waters. Police say that 6 days ago, on the 6th of March, they were notified by international law enforcement counterparts that that vessel may indeed contain drugs, and they launched a joint operation involving the AFP, New South Wales Police, and the Australian Border Force. So when that mothership came into Australian waters, the daughter ship left Sydney and went out to meet it. Police will allege that 200 kilograms of cocaine was transferred from the larger ship onto the smaller ship, at which point they intercepted and arrested and charged a 27-year-old man from South Australia. Now, he's due to appear in court later today. He's been charged with possessing and importing a border-controlled substance. As well as the drugs, police seized about $500,000 of cash from a storage shed in Sydney that's also linked to this operation. Detective Chief Superintendent Darren Bennett says this is not the first time a mothership-daughtership situation has unfolded during the COVID-19 pandemic.
This is the third time we've had a small vessel import large quantities of cocaine since the COVID crisis started. It's an example of how we have to be flexible in terms of managing the changes to their operations that organised transnational criminals do, and the actual exhibits themselves had to be managed with advice from the New South Wales Health Department.
Police say this is an ongoing operation, so we could be seeing more seizures or more arrests in coming days.
West Australians are going to the polls tomorrow after what's been a rather unusual